Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless Official 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Nick Newman had always imagined the worst-case scenario in the back of his mind: Sharon in danger, Sharon calling for help, Sharon reaching for him in the dark, but never, not even in his most tortured nightmares, did he envision the exact chain of events that unfolded on that horrifying night when Matt Clark, reborn as the monstrous Mitch Bacall, decided to take his final shot at destroying both of them in one ruthless strike, a strike fueled by vengeance, obsession, and a sick satisfaction that he believed would finally give him the twisted victory he had chased for decades, but instead it delivered the deadliest, most devastating loss the Newmans would ever endure. The night began with a chill in the air, the kind that settles under the skin like a warning no one can hear until it's too late, and Sharon had been wandering her house in the dim light, trying to shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, that something lurked just beyond her reach, just outside her vision, waiting. She didn't know Matt had slipped inside hours earlier, didn't know he'd cut the power, didn't know he'd watched her move from room to room with a predator's patience, waiting for her panic to crest, waiting for the exact second he could strike. Because Matt didn't want a quick kill, he wanted Sharon to feel fear in every breath, every heartbeat, every second leading up to the moment he made her suffer for the life he believed she had stolen from him. When the fire alarm blared suddenly, piercing the silence with a shriek of terror, Sharon thought it was a malfunction, a spark, anything normal, but the instant she reached up to silence it, Matt came out of the shadows like a nightmare made flesh, his voice a cold whisper against her ear, his hand gripping her arm with bone-crushing force as she gasped, her scream swallowed by the adrenaline flooding her body. She fought, she always fought, but Matt was fueled by madness, by years of festering hatred, and when she slipped from his grasp and sprinted toward the front door, he lunged and tackled her to the floor, his fist colliding with her ribs, his knee pinning her down as he growled that she had taken too much from him, that tonight she would pay, that Nick wouldn't make it in time to save her. Sharon clawed at the floor, struggled to breathe, tried desperately to fight him off even as her vision blurred from the blow to her temple, and somewhere in her panic-blurred mind she prayed Nick was already on his way, but Matt laughed, told her he wanted Nick to find her broken and bleeding because that was the only ending that made sense after everything they'd taken from him. Meanwhile, Nick had been driving faster than he had in years, his heart racing, his instincts screaming, because the moment Sharon's call cut off mid-sentence and the background sounds dissolved into chaos, he knew, something was wrong, something was happening, something she couldn't outrun alone. His hand shook on the wheel as he floored the gas, desperate, terrified, praying he wasn't too late yet again. Every memory of Sharon flashed behind his eyes, their love, their children, their heartbreaks and reconciliations, every moment that tied them together across a lifetime of mistakes and miracles. And he swore he would not lose her tonight, not like this, not to a ghost from their past who should have stayed buried. But fate doesn't care about devotion or promises or history, and when Nick burst through the door of Sharon's house, sprinting into the dimly lit chaos, the sight that greeted him wasn't something any man could ever recover from: Sharon on the floor, struggling weakly, Matt's hands around her throat, her eyes fluttering as she fought to stay alive. The world narrowed into a tunnel of pure instinct. Nick didn't speak, didn't hesitate, didn't think, he fired. One shot. Straight through Matt Clark's chest. Matt jerked, eyes widening with a mixture of shock and fury before he crumpled to the ground beside Sharon, blood pooling beneath him as the last of his rage flickered out like a dying flame. Nick didn't look at him again, he couldn't. Matt was finally gone, really gone this time, but Nick knew that even in death, Matt had still taken something from them. Nick dropped to Sharon's side, gathering her into his arms, his hands trembling violently as he cupped her face, begging her to stay awake, begging her to look at him, begging her to breathe because she was barely conscious, blood soaking through her shirt, staining his hands, staining his clothes, staining the floor in a way that told him she was hurt far worse than he had realized. Sharon tried to speak, her lips trembling, her breath coming in shallow, broken gasps as she whispered Nick's name like it was the last word she would ever say. Nick pressed his forehead to hers, his voice cracking as he promised her she was safe now, that he had her, that he wasn't letting her go, not tonight, not ever. He carried her to the car because waiting for an ambulance felt like gambling with time he wasn't sure she had, and as he sped toward the hospital with Sharon in his lap, cradled against him, her blood seeping through his fingers, he kept whispering that she just needed to hold on a little longer. But Sharon's breaths grew quieter, her body weaker, her weight heavier in a way that terrified him more than anything Matt had ever done. Halfway to the hospital, she opened her eyes for the last time. She looked at him, really looked at him, and there was something peaceful and heartbreaking in her expression, as if she finally understood something he didn't, something she didn't have the strength to explain. She whispered, "Nick. I'm sorry," her voice barely audible, and he shook his head frantically, telling her she had nothing to be sorry for, telling her she couldn't leave him, telling her their story wasn't ending here. But Sharon's breaths came slower, softer, fading like a candle flickering in a draft. Nick pulled over on the side of the road, unable to drive another inch because he could feel it, he could feel her slipping away in his arms. He screamed for her to stay awake, screamed for her to breathe, screamed her name as if sheer force could keep her alive, but the moment her chest stilled, the moment her fingers fell limp against his, the moment her eyes closed for the final time, Nick Newman felt the world collapse. Sharon died in his arms on the side of the road, just minutes before they reached the hospital. Nick held her for what felt like hours, sobbing into her hair, rocking her like she could somehow come back if he just refused to let go. Blood dried on his hands, on his clothes, on his face where he had pressed his cheek against hers, and the silence around him felt suffocating, mocking, cruel. Matt's death should have felt like justice, like victory, like closure, but instead it felt hollow, because killing Matt hadn't saved Sharon. Nothing had saved Sharon. And as the flashing lights of the approaching ambulance illuminated the darkness around him, Nick whispered her name like a broken prayer, knowing that no matter how many times he replayed the moment he fired, or the second he arrived, or the split-second choices he made, nothing would ever change the fact that he had been just too late. Not too late to kill the monster who haunted them, but too late to save the woman he had loved for most of his life. And that cruel twist, that unbearable irony, became the tragedy that shattered everything. Nick saved Sharon's life from Matt, only to lose her minutes later, bleeding out in his arms beneath the cold, indifferent night sky. Nick didn't remember the paramedics pulling him back, didn't remember the officers who arrived on scene, didn't remember the questions that were fired at him or the hands that tried to steady him, because the moment Sharon's heart stopped beating in his arms, everything else around him blurred into static, like the world had been drained of color and sound and meaning in an instant. He kept staring at her face, pale and peaceful in a way that felt wrong, horrific, unnatural. Sharon was supposed to smile, to laugh, to fight, to breathe. She wasn't supposed to look still. She wasn't supposed to look gone. He tried to move toward her when they lifted her onto the stretcher, his knees buckling beneath him, but a medic caught him before he hit the ground. Nick's voice cracked as he begged them to help her, begged them to try something, anything, even if he knew on some level that the light already fading from her skin meant there was no miracle coming. She wasn't gone long, he kept saying, choking on the words as if speaking them might undo the reality he was drowning in. She wasn't gone long, please, please, she just needs help, she just needs, but the medic's eyes said everything. They had already lost her. At the hospital, chaos exploded the moment they realized whose body was being wheeled into a trauma room. Nurses gasped, doctors froze, and a crushing silence spread through the hallways as the truth landed like a meteor. Sharon Collins Newman Rosales was dead. A name woven through decades of scandals, recoveries, romances, heartbreak, triumphs, and tragedies, suddenly gone. Within minutes, word spread faster than the doctors could confirm it. And as Nick stood alone in the hallway outside the trauma bay, his hands still stained with Sharon's blood, his shirt stiff with it, his breathing shaky and uneven, he felt a physical ache tear through his chest, like the very center of him had been ripped out. He could still hear her final breath. He could still feel her hand slipping away from his. He could still see the exact moment the life left her eyes. And as he replayed it in a relentless loop, he found himself wondering whether the universe was punishing him, whether this was the price he was destined to pay for every time he had failed her, walked away from her, hurt her, or let her down. He wondered if she had died thinking he didn't love her enough, didn't protect her enough, didn't save her in time. He wondered if Sharon had slipped from the world believing her last apology meant something terrible, some regret he would never understand or be able to fix. "I'm sorry," she had whispered. "Sorry for what? Sorry for being hurt? Sorry for leaving him? Sorry for the life they lost and never got back?" That one unfinished message became a punishment that carved into Nick like a blade. He didn't notice Faith rushing through the hospital doors until she collided with him, sobbing so violently her entire body shook. "Dad, where is she? Where's Mom? What happened? Please tell me she's okay. Please, please." He couldn't speak. He couldn't form the words. The silence was the answer. And when Faith saw the blood on his shirt, her face crumpled in a single, heartbreaking collapse of hope. She screamed, a raw, agonized sound that echoed down the hallway, and clung to him like she was drowning. Nick wrapped his arms around her, shaking so hard he thought his bones might splinter. "I tried," he whispered into her hair, over and over. I tried, I swear I tried." But Faith could barely breathe through her sobs, and all she could manage was, "She can't be gone. She can't be gone. She can't be gone." Mariah arrived moments later, then Noah, then Tessa, then Chance, each one reacting with the same shock, the same horror, the same grief. Mariah punched the wall so hard her knuckles split. Noah collapsed onto a bench, burying his face in his hands. Tessa held Faith as she shook uncontrollably. Chance asked the same question everyone else was too scared to voice: how could this have happened? But it was only when Ray's mother, Celeste, appeared at the hospital, her face paling as she learned Sharon would now be joining her son in death, that the weight of the tragedy became unbearable. For years, the universe had stolen pieces of Sharon bit by bit, taking Cassie, taking Ray, taking her stability, her health, her peace, but no one expected it to take Sharon herself. Not like this. Not at Matt Clark's hands. Not after everything she had survived. Nick watched each member of her family crumble, and while they mourned, he carried the unbearable truth like a stone. He had shot Matt, but he hadn't saved Sharon. She had died minutes later, with her blood on his hands, his shirt, his memory. He walked out of the hospital alone and didn't remember how he got home. The house was quiet when he entered, far too quiet, and for the first time in decades the Newman ranch felt cold, hollow, foreign. He stopped in the doorway, staring at the space where he had once kissed Sharon goodnight, where they had fought and reconciled, where they had raised children, made promises, broken them, rebuilt them, loved and mourned and tried again and again. The weight of absence crushed him. It was as if the house itself knew she was gone. He sank to the floor, exhausted, grief-stricken, and numb. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He didn't move for what felt like hours. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her blood, heard her final breath, felt her slipping from his arms. He replayed the moment he shot Matt, over and over, trying to convince himself he made the right choice, that he had saved her from something worse. But guilt gnawed at him like a living thing. What if he had arrived 2 minutes earlier? What if he had called the police sooner? What if he had driven faster? What if? Each question cut deeper. Meanwhile, Sharon's body lay in the hospital morgue, tagged and covered, waiting for the next steps of a tragedy no one was emotionally prepared for. Her death became a storm that spread through Genoa City like wildfire. The news hit Crimson Lights first, then the ranch, then Newman Media, then society. People stopped in their tracks. They cried. They whispered her name with disbelief. Even those who hadn't been close to her in years felt the impact, because Sharon had been a fixture of the town, its moral compass, its nurturer, its constant. Victor Newman sat in his chair for a long time, unmoving, processing the fact that the woman who had raised his grandchildren, who had survived cancer, who had forgiven his son countless times, was no longer alive. Nikki cried quietly, her hand shaking as she held Victor's. Victoria broke down at her desk when she heard Nick's voice crack while telling her. Even Adam, who had once weaponized Sharon's vulnerabilities, found himself speechless and hollowed out, unable to imagine a Genoa City where she no longer existed to call him out, forgive him, or challenge him. but the person who shattered the most was Faith. Hours after leaving the hospital, she stormed into Nick's house, her face blotchy, her eyes swollen, her breath uneven. "What happened?" she demanded, voice shaking with fury and grief. "Tell me everything. Every detail. Don't protect me, I want to know. I have to know." Nick hesitated. He didn't want her to hear the violence, the terror, the brutality of what her mother endured, but Faith grabbed his arm, sobbing, "I need to know how she died. I need to know if she was scared. I need to know if she was alone." Nick swallowed hard, his voice hoarse as he told her the truth, that Sharon had fought, that Sharon had tried to escape, that Matt had hurt her, that he had shot Matt to save her, and that she had died minutes later in his arms. Faith broke again, collapsing to the floor, screaming in anguish as Nick held her, crying into her hair. "I didn't get to say goodbye," she sobbed. "I didn't get to tell her I loved her." The next morning, the coroner's official report confirmed that Sharon's injuries from Matt's attack caused internal bleeding too severe for survival. Even if she had reached the hospital a few minutes earlier, her chances were slim. The explanation did nothing to ease Nick's guilt. He blamed himself anyway. Funeral arrangements began, though no one was ready for them. Mariah and Tessa struggled to pick a photo for the memorial slide. Faith refused to choose a burial outfit because picking one meant accepting Sharon wasn't coming back. Noah volunteered to organize the ceremony but kept breaking down mid-sentence. Even Victor offered to cover all expenses, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. Nikki volunteered to handle the reception because she couldn't bear to see Nick in his current state. Nick didn't want to plan anything. He didn't want to sign papers. He didn't want to choose flowers or caskets or readings. All he wanted was Sharon back. All he wanted was one more chance to save her. One more chance to pull up to the house 2 minutes earlier. One more chance to put himself between her and Matt. He avoided everyone for hours until he finally slipped into the morgue alone, unable to stay away any longer. Seeing her lying motionless beneath a thin sheet nearly broke him. He placed a trembling hand on her forehead, whispering through tears, "I was supposed to protect you. I was supposed to save you." His voice cracked as he added, "I'm so sorry, Sharon. I'm so sorry." He kissed her cold forehead and stayed with her until the hospital staff gently guided him out. Back at home, Nick stared at his blood-stained shirt hanging over the back of a chair. Every time he looked at it, he felt the moment all over again, the fear, the guilt, the desperation, the heartbreak. But he couldn't throw it away. He couldn't wash it. It was the last physical proof that Sharon had been in his arms. He didn't know how to live in a world without her. He didn't know how to tell their children everything would be okay when it clearly wouldn't be. He didn't know how to face the funeral. Or the condolences. Or the memories. Or the empty seat at family dinners. All he knew was this. He arrived in time to kill Matt Clark. But he arrived just a few minutes too late to save Sharon. And those few minutes became the tragedy that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The days leading up to Sharon's funeral felt unreal, as though time had stopped but somehow kept dragging everyone forward against their will. Nick moved through his house like a ghost, barely speaking, barely sleeping, barely able to endure the quiet that pressed in on him from every corner. Every room reminded him of her, her laughter, her voice, the scent of her perfume, the gentle way she had always steadied him when life became too heavy. Now the air felt sterile. Lifeless. Wrong. He would catch himself listening for the sound of her footsteps, for the soft hum she made while wiping down the coffee counter, for the warmth in her voice when she said his name, but all he heard was silence, and it was suffocating. Faith stayed with him those first few nights, refusing to leave him alone with his grief. But even her presence couldn't fill the void. Sometimes Nick would wake up from a nightmare, Sharon gasping for breath, reaching for him, slipping away no matter how tightly he held her, and Faith would sit beside him, crying softly because she'd heard his screams through the walls. "I miss her too, Dad," she whispered each time, hoping the words might stitch even a small part of his heart back together. But Nick could only nod, still drowning in the memory of Sharon's final breath on the side of the road. On the third night, Noah returned to check on him. He found Nick sitting on the floor in the dim light, staring at Sharon's old scarf as if it were the last relic of a sacred life. "Dad," Noah said gently, kneeling beside him, "you don't have to go through this alone." Nick didn't answer. He couldn't. His grief was a fortress, cold, impenetrable, built from guilt, regret, and the haunting belief that he had failed the most important person in his life. When Noah placed a hand on his shoulder, Nick finally broke, sobbing in deep, painful waves that shook his entire body. Noah held him, tears streaming down his own face, whispering, "It wasn't your fault. You tried. You saved her from him. You did everything you could." But Nick only shook his head, choking out, "I was too late." Meanwhile, Genoa City felt the loss like a wound. Crimson Light stayed closed for the first time in years, a bouquet of flowers left on the doorstep every few hours as people passed by in mourning. Messages filled the windows, handwritten notes from strangers, old customers, friends, people Sharon had helped through some crisis or another. Her kindness had reached further than she ever realized, touching lives in quiet, profound ways. Now those lives ached with the emptiness she left behind. Even Adam found himself wandering near the boarded cafe, the weight of his own complicated history with Sharon pressing on him like a stone. He remembered every moment she had pulled him back from the edge, every time she had chosen compassion when no one else would. He whispered into the cold air, "You saved me more times than I deserved." His voice cracked as he added, "I just wish I could have saved you."